Don't be dramatic, Dana. They were fine. It was 2 hours. That's what my mother said. From my sister's party, on speakerphone, over the sound of a crowd, while I stood in a hospital gown with a surgical drain still taped to my side, having just been told that my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old had been found sitting alone on our neighbor's front porch. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just held the phone and listened to her chew something on the other end, and I understood, all the way down, a thing I had spent 36 years refusing to understand. Everyone expected me to let it go, to accept the apology that wasn't coming, to keep the peace, to tell myself it was a mistake, the way I'd told myself 100 mistakes before it. That's what the good daughter does. That's what I had always done. Instead, I hung up the phone. And within 24 hours, I had changed every lock on my house, every emergency contact on every form, and confirmed one specific line in my will that I'd already changed weeks before. Now, I know how that sounds. The daughter who overreacts, who can't take a joke, who ruins the family over one afternoon. That's the story they're telling right now, to anyone who'll listen. But here's what my mother didn't know when she told me not to be dramatic. Weeks before that surgery, before the porch, before the 14 missed calls, before any of it, I had quietly changed something. A name on a legal form. And it wasn't hers anymore. It had stopped being hers a long time ago. She just hadn't been told yet. What happened while I was unconscious didn't change my mind about my parents. It only proved I'd already been right. My name is Dana Mercer, and to understand the phone call and the quiet thing I'd done weeks before it, I have to take you back to 6:45 on the morning of the surgery, the last time I ever trusted my parents with anything that mattered. Now, 6:45 in the morning. I am a physical therapist. I've spent 12 years teaching people how to trust their own bodies again after those bodies have betrayed them. Stroke patients relearning a fork. Kids with cerebral palsy taking a first unaided step. Old men who cried when they climbed their own porch stairs for the first time in a year. I am good at it. I am patient in a way I am not patient about anything else. Because I've learned that the body heals on its own schedule, and no amount of wishing speeds it up. I mention this because it's the thing my family has never once asked me about. In 36 years, my mother has never asked me a single question about my work. She knows I do something with patients. She has told people at church that I'm a nurse's helper, which I have corrected exactly 0 times. Because correcting my mother is a thing you learn not to do. My husband is named Evan. He builds custom cabinets, good hands, quiet voice, the kind of man who notices when you've gone quiet and doesn't make you explain it. We have 2 children. Oliver is 7, serious, a rule follower, a boy who lines his shoes up at night. Nora is 5, no relation to anyone you know, just a 5-year-old. Loud and fearless and convinced she is the boss of the house. Which, to be fair, she mostly is. And that spring, I found out I needed surgery. Nothing dramatic. The surgery is not the story, so I'll say it fast. A mass on my thyroid, almost certainly benign, but it had to come out. And coming out meant general anesthesia and an overnight stay and about a week where I couldn't lift anything, including my own children. Routine. The kind of thing thousands of women do every day. But it meant that for one day and the night after, I could not be the one who took care of my kids. And so, for the first time in a long time, I had to ask someone else to. Here is a thing I need you to understand about me because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. I do not ask my parents for help. As a rule, as a policy. As a thing I decided somewhere in my 20s without ever quite saying it out loud. It's not because of one big thing. It's because of 1,000 small ones. And I'll give you 2, because 2 is enough for you to see the pattern I spent 30 years pretending not to see. When I was 9, I threw up at school. The stomach flu, the kind that empties you out. The nurse called my mother to come get me, and I sat on the vinyl cot in the nurse's office, shaking, waiting for her. And 45 minutes later, it wasn't my mother who came. It was my Aunt Denise, my mother's sister, who arrived flustered and kind and drove me home, and who let it slip in the car, not meaning to, that my mother had a hair appointment she couldn't move. I was 9. I did the math a 9-year-old does. My throw-up was worth less than a haircut. I filed that away. Children file everything away. When I was 17, my car died on a county road 40 minutes from home, 11 at night, no streetlights. I called my father. And my father, I can still hear it, sighed the sigh of a man deeply inconvenienced, told me to figure it out, it builds character, and hung up. A trucker stopped, an actual stranger, and waited with me until the tow came. A stranger doing the thing my father wouldn't. Even then, at 17, some part of me noticed, it's always the stranger. The people who are supposed to come don't, and a stranger does. I was starting to collect the evidence. If you've ever been the one who plans for everyone, who packs the bag, writes the list, thinks of the thing nobody else thinks of, and then gets called dramatic for caring, hit like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There's a new confession here every day, and I like knowing who's out there. My sister Brooke never learned that lesson because she never had to. Brooke is 3 years younger than me, and Brooke has been the main event of my family since the day she was born. When Brooke needs something, my parents move mountains. When Brooke got divorced, my mother flew across the country and stayed for a month. When Brooke wanted to start a business, she has started 4, my father co-signed the loan without blinking. Brooke is the sun my parents orbit, and I am the reliable satellite they forget is even up there until they need something tracked. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Or I told myself I did. You can tell yourself a thing is fine for years, and mostly believe it, right up until the day it isn't fine. And then you find out you never believed it at all. So when I needed someone to watch Oliver and Nora on the day of my surgery, my first 11 ideas were not my parents. Evan would be at the hospital with me. That wasn't a question. He wasn't going to drop me at a surgical center and drive away. My best friend Priya offered, but she had her own kids and a work trip that week. Our regular sitter was on vacation. I went down the whole list, twice. And then my mother, of all people, offered. She offered, and I said yes, and I need you to understand why, because it matters. She offered on a Sunday, at dinner, at my parents' house, in front of everyone. Brooke's new boyfriend, my father at the head of the table. I'd made the mistake of mentioning the surgery, and mentioning that I was still figuring out the kids, and my mother set down her fork and offered in that particular way she has that isn't an offer so much as a performance of one, aimed at the audience as much as at me. "Well, we'll just take the kids," she said, waving her hand like she was brushing away something silly. "Honestly, Dana, you don't have to make everything so complicated. They're our grandchildren. We'd love to have them." And then, the line, the one that did it. "It's about time you let us." Around the table, everyone nodded. Brooke said something like, "Yeah, Dana, let Mom help, God." And I sat there cast, in one sentence, as the villain of my own caution, the uptight daughter who won't let her poor mother love her grandchildren. That's the trap of a family like mine. They fail you 1,000 times in private, and then offer to help once in public. And if you say no, you're the cold one, the dramatic one, the one who holds a grudge. The offer isn't really an offer, it's a dare. Say no and prove you're the problem. It's about time you let us. Like my caution was an insult to them. Like the wall I'd built over 30 years was a thing I'd done to them, instead of a thing they'd built for me, one broken promise at a time. And here's the thing, I wanted it to be true. That's the part I'm not proud of and won't leave out. Some stupid 9-year-old part of me, the part still standing in the school office waiting for a mother who sent someone else, That part wanted so badly for this to be the time they showed up. For my mother to be, just once, the kind of grandmother who takes the kids and gets it right. I looked at her across that table, and against every piece of evidence I owned, I let myself hope. So I said yes. But, and this is the part that matters, the part I'll come back to, I did not only say yes. Because I am my mother's daughter in exactly one way. I plan for the version of people they've shown me they are, even while I'm hoping for the version I want. So 3 weeks before that morning, before I ever dropped my kids off, I had already done one quiet thing my parents knew nothing about. I'll tell you what it was when we get there. Just know that I did it early, and I told almost no one, and it's the reason this story ends the way it does. The morning of the surgery, I got up at 5:30. I hadn't slept. I made the kids lunches even though they'd be at my parents'. Old habit, and also I didn't trust that they'd be fed the way I feed them. I packed a bag for each kid. Oliver's inhaler, though he hadn't needed it in months. Nora's specific blanket, the one she cannot sleep without, the loss of which is a 5-alarm emergency. And I made the folder. I want you to see this folder because it becomes important. A plain manila folder, and on the front, in my careful physical therapist handwriting, I wrote everything. Both kids' full names and birth dates, our pediatrician's number, the after-hours nurse line, our insurance information, front and back, photocopied. A list of allergies, Oliver and shellfish, Nora and the amoxicillin that gives her hives. The hospital where I'd be, the surgeon's name, Evan's cell, Priya's cell as backup. Nora's nap schedule, Oliver's reading homework, which was due Monday. What they like to eat, what scares them. The exact words that calm Nora down when she has a nightmare. You're in the green room. You're safe. The green room is safe. A thing from a game we play. 12 years of taking care of fragile people taught me to write it all down, because in an emergency, the panicking brain forgets everything. I made that folder the way I'd make a care plan for a patient. I made it out of love, and out of 36 years of knowing better. And I handed it to my mother at 6:45 in the morning, and I said, "Everything's in here, everything you could need. Call Evan if anything at all comes up." And my mother took the folder. She held it for a second. She did not open it. She looked at it the way you look at a thing someone hands you that you've already decided you don't need. A little amused, a little insulted. And she set it down on the hall table by her front door, and she patted it once, like patting a dog. And she said, "Dana, relax. I raised 2 kids. I think I can handle a Tuesday." I raised 2 kids. As if raising me had been a thing she'd done with attention. As if the folder were an insult to her competence instead of what it actually was, which was a map, drawn in love, of how to keep the 2 most important people in the world safe for one single day. That folder sat on that hall table, unopened, for the entire 2 hours my children were alone in my locked house across town. Every number she needed was in it. The after-hours nurse line, Evan's cell, mine, the words that calm Nora down. All of it, 6 inches from where my mother set it down. And she was 3 miles away at a party, and my son was standing at a window, waiting. The folder didn't fail. I didn't fail. The folder was perfect. It just needed someone to open it. I kissed them goodbye. Oliver, who was nervous, he'd picked up that something was happening, the way serious children do, held on to me a second longer than usual, and I told him I'd see him tomorrow and we'd get pancakes, and he nodded like a man accepting terms. Nora barely looked up from the couch. She was watching her show, and she was in a strange house with her grandparents, and it was an adventure. I told her I loved her. She said, "Love you, bye," without turning around, which is exactly how it should be. A 5-year-old so secure she doesn't need to watch her mother leave. That is the last normal memory I have of that day. My kids, safe, on a couch, in a house I trusted them in for exactly as long as it took me to drive away. Evan drove me to Ridgeview. I remember being calm in the car. I remember thinking, of all things, that it was nice, that for once someone else had the kids and I could just be a person having a medical procedure. That my mother had finally been given a chance to show up, and I had finally let her. I held Evan's hand in the waiting room. They called my name. I changed into the gown, and the nurse put in the IV, and the anesthesiologist counted backward, and I went down into that particular nothing that is nothing at all. I was under for a little under 3 hours. When I woke up, the world had already ended, and I just didn't know it yet. Here's what happened while I was unconscious. I've put it together since, from Oliver mostly, who tells it in the flat, careful way he tells everything, which is somehow worse than crying. About 40 minutes after I went under, my sister Brooke called my mother. Brooke was hosting something that afternoon. A launch party for her newest business, the fourth one, some kind of essential oils meets jewelry situation, at a rented event space across town. It started at 11, and Brooke wanted my parents there. Not needed, wanted. My mother, she has since said, didn't think it would be a problem. My father, who I will never fully forgive for this because he knew better and did it anyway, figured the kids would be fine for a bit. So at 10:40 in the morning, my parents put my 7-year-old and my 5-year-old in the car. They drove them back to my house, my empty, locked house, because I was in surgery and Evan was at the hospital. And they dropped them off, in the driveway, with a house key I had given my mother years ago for emergencies. My mother walked my 2 children up to the door, unlocked it, and, this is the part I still can't hold in my hand without my chest going tight, told my 7-year-old son that he was in charge, that they'd be back soon, that he should watch his sister and not answer the door for strangers. And then my parents drove to my sister's essential oils party. Oliver is 7. He did exactly what he was told. I know those 2 hours now because Oliver tells it the way he tells everything, in order, leaving nothing out. He watched Grandma's car back out of the driveway, and he waited for it to come back because she'd said, "Be back soon." And soon is a word a 7-year-old takes literally. After a while, Nora wanted a snack, and here's where my son did the thing that breaks me every time. He went to the kitchen, and he looked at the stove, and he remembered I'd told him the stove was for grown-ups, and he decided, 7 years old, alone, that he would not touch it, even though his sister was hungry, because rules were the only adult in the house. So he peeled her a banana and told her that was lunch for now, and Nora, who does not accept for now, started to cry. He checked the front door was locked, more than once. He didn't answer it, not even when someone knocked, because I'd taught him not to open the door for strangers, and my teaching him well is the exact thing that kept my 7-year-old standing sentry at a locked door for 2 hours. He did not cry. He told me that part like it was the thing he'd done right. "I didn't cry, Mom. I was in charge, so I didn't cry." Nora had no idea anything was wrong. She thought it was a normal, boring afternoon because Oliver carried all the fear for both of them and never let her see it. That's what a good big brother does. It was Nora who broke the rule, thank God. Nora got hungry, and Nora is 5 and fears nothing, and when Oliver couldn't work the stove, because he's 7 and he's not supposed to, because I taught him not to, Nora decided they should go find help. She took her brother's hand, my fearless girl, and she led him out the front door and down the street to Mrs. Doyle's house, the neighbor 2 doors down, an older woman who has waved at my kids their whole lives. Ruth Doyle is 64 years old, and she is not a stranger, and that matters to everything that comes after, so let me be clear about who she is. Ruth taught 4th grade for 31 years, 2 towns over, before she retired and moved on to our street. She's watched my kids a dozen times. The afternoon Nora spiked a fever and my sitter fell through, I called Ruth in a panic and she said, "Bring her over, I've got soup on." The school half-days when I was stuck at the clinic, the one date night Evan and I managed, when Ruth had the kids in pajamas reading books by the time we got home. Ruth is the person on our street who knows which kid is allergic to what. She was doing her crossword when the doorbell rang, and she opened her door to find my 2 children on her porch, Oliver holding Nora's hand the way I'd taught him to crossing a street, except there was no street. There was just my 7-year-old holding on to his sister, because holding on was the job he'd been given. Oliver explained the situation to her the way he explains everything, in order, leaving nothing out. That Grandma had brought them home and gone away. That they didn't know when she was coming back. That Nora was hungry and he wasn't allowed to use the stove. That he wasn't supposed to answer the door for strangers, but Nora said Mrs. Doyle wasn't a stranger because she waves. And Ruth Doyle, who had made these 2 children soup when they were sick and read them books at bedtime, took one look at them on her porch and did the thing my own parents were, at that very moment, 3 miles away, failing to do. She brought them inside. She sat them at her kitchen table, the one with the plastic tablecloth. She made Nora a peanut butter sandwich, cut into triangles, because she is of a generation that knows a sandwich cut into triangles is a different and better sandwich. She poured them each a glass of milk. And then, while my children ate, she started working the phone. She called me first. She had my number. She'd had it for years. But my phone was in a plastic bag in a surgical locker, ringing to no one. She called Evan. His phone was on silent in the waiting room, buried in a jacket pocket, the way phones are during surgery. She left us both voicemails, her voice staying calm for the children's sake. Then she tried the one other number she had, Gail's, because Ruth knew my mother was the one watching them that day. She dialed my mother 4 times. My mother, who does not answer her phone at a party, not even for the neighbor she knew was minding her grandchildren, picked up on the 4th. When my mother finally picked up, Ruth Doyle told her, calmly, that the Mercer children were at her house on Linden Court and needed collecting. And my mother, I have this word for word from Ruth, who has no reason to soften it or sharpen it. My mother laughed, a light little laugh. "Oh, those 2, she said. Such adventurers. Tell them Grandma says to behave. I'll send someone. Tell them Grandma says to behave." To the neighbor she'd left holding the children she abandoned. My mother did not leave the party. She did not get in her car. She was, by Ruth's account, holding a glass of something and standing near a display of essential oils when she said, "I'll send someone." And the someone she sent was my father, who arrived at Ruth Doyle's house 40 minutes later. 40 more minutes, mildly annoyed at the interruption, and collected my 2 children from Ruth's kitchen table, without, Ruth told me, apologizing. He said, "Thanks for keeping an eye on them," and he took my kids and he left. Like Ruth had done him a small favor. Like watching 2 abandoned children for an hour was a neighborly courtesy, the kind you nod about over a fence. 14 times in that window, someone tried to reach me. Mrs. Doyle, once she pieced together which hospital, the hospital's front desk. Evan, who'd stepped out of the waiting room and come back to a voicemail. 14 missed calls, stacking up on a phone in a plastic bag in a recovery room, while I slept the chemical sleep of the anesthetized, and my children ate Ruth's sandwiches at Ruth's kitchen table and waited. I woke up slowly. Anesthesia doesn't release you all at once. It lets you go in stages, and the first thing back is usually sound. I heard the beep of the monitor. I heard Evan's voice, low and wrong, not the calm voice, the other one, the one I'd heard maybe twice in 10 years. And then I was awake enough to see his face, and I knew before he said a word that something had happened to one of my children, because that is the only thing that makes Evan's face look like that. "They're okay," he said first, which is the right thing to say and also the thing that tells you instantly that they were not, at some point, okay. "Dana, the kids are okay. Your dad has them now. Everyone's fine." And then he told me. In the recovery room, 6 words at a time, while a nurse checked my drain and pretended not to listen. "Your parents left. The kids were alone. Mrs. Doyle found them. Your dad got them. They're fine now." Everyone's fine. I want to describe what happened in my body when I understood, because it wasn't what I expected, and I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. I expected rage. I am a person who runs warm, I expected to come up out of that anesthesia swinging. But that's not what happened. What happened first was cold. A spreading cold, starting behind my sternum and moving out, and it wasn't the cold of shock. It was the cold of confirmation. It was the specific temperature of a thing you have always known being proven true at last. Because I didn't think, how could they? That's the thing. Some animal part of me that had been keeping records since I was 9 on that vinyl cot thought only, oh, there it is. Of course. I'd built my whole adult life around not needing them precisely because I knew, somewhere I didn't look directly, that if I ever really needed them, in a way that couldn't be rescheduled, they would not come. And I had finally, against my better judgment, needed them. And they had not come. And a 5-year-old had walked out of a locked house to find food. The thing I'd spent 36 years building walls against had finally happened. And it hadn't happened to me, it had happened to my children. That's the part that turned the cold into something else. They'd had 36 years to fail me, and I'd built my armor. My kids had none. I was their armor, and I'd handed them, for one day, to the people I'd spent my whole life guarding against. I asked for my phone. Evan didn't want to give it to me. I was an hour out of surgery, but he did because he knows me. 14 missed calls. And I did the thing you do, the animal thing. I called my mother. Not Mrs. Doyle, not my kids, not yet. My mother. Because 36 years of training runs deep, and some part of me still, even then, wanted her to say the thing that would make it make sense. She picked up on the third ring, cheerful, party noise behind her. Hi, honey. How'd it go? Are you all done? I said, where are my children? And there was a pause, and I heard her cover the phone and say something to someone, laughing, and come back, and she said, they're fine, they're with the neighbor, your dad's got it handled. Honestly, it turned into such a thing. Brooke's event is lovely, you should see the turnout. You left them alone. Dana. And here it came, the voice, the one I'd heard my whole life, the one that turns your own feelings into your own fault. Don't be dramatic. They were fine. It was 2 hours. Oliver's very responsible. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. My son, 7 years old, sat by a window for 2 hours believing he was responsible for keeping his sister alive. My daughter walked out of a house and down a street alone because she was hungry. A retired schoolteacher, $2 down, fed my children because the people I trusted with them were drinking Prosecco at an essential oils launch. And my mother, standing in that party, said nothing happened. It was 2 hours, she said again when I didn't speak. You'd think I committed a crime. You always do this. You blow everything up. This is exactly why nobody wants to. I hung up. I didn't slam it. I didn't scream. I just took the phone away from my ear, and I pressed the red circle, and the party noise and my mother's voice both stopped at once, and the recovery room was very quiet, and Evan was looking at me, and I said the only thing I knew all the way to the bottom. They're done, I said. They're done with my kids. Now here is where I take you back to that morning, to the thing I did quietly, because this is where it stops being a story about what they did to me and becomes a story about what I'd already decided. 3 weeks before the surgery, when I first scheduled it, when I first sat with the reality that I'd need someone to watch my kids, I did 2 things on the same afternoon. The first one, everybody would understand. I asked my mother, eventually, because I ran out of other options and because I hoped. But the second thing, I told no one. That same week, on a Thursday afternoon while the kids were at school, I drove to the office of a lawyer named Sandra Klein. Second floor of a converted Victorian on Main Street, the same office where Evan and I had written our first will 6 years earlier, when Oliver was a baby and the whole idea of dying and leaving him behind was so abstract we'd checked the Guardian box in about 4 seconds. Sandra remembered us. She got out our file. And she asked what I wanted to change, pen ready, expecting a small thing, an address, an executor. And I sat in that chair, and I found I couldn't say it for a second. Because saying it out loud made it real. Sandra waited. She's good at waiting. I imagine you learn that in her work. And finally I said, I want to change the guardianship. If something happens to me and Evan, I don't want it to be my parents anymore. She didn't look surprised, which I was grateful for. She just nodded and asked who I wanted instead. And I told her I'd already thought about it, that there was only one honest answer, and that I'd spent a long time not letting myself say it out loud. I'd known for weeks who I didn't want. What took me longer was admitting there was someone I did, and that she'd been right in front of me the whole time. Here is a thing being a physical therapist teaches you. Hope for recovery, but build for the fall. Always. You bolt the grab bar into the wall before anyone slips, not after. Because after is a hospital and a hip replacement and a person who never walks the same again. You do not wait for the fall to prove you needed the bar. You look at the person, and you look at the floor, and you do the math, and you drill the holes. In our original will, if something happened to both Evan and me, our children went to my parents. Because that's what you do. They were the grandparents. It was the default. The box you check without thinking when your kids are babies and your parents are just grandma and grandpa. And you haven't yet let yourself count up all the small betrayals into one honest number. That afternoon, 3 weeks before the surgery, I changed it. But before I signed a single page, I did the thing you're supposed to do. The thing that turns a name on paper into a real plan. I asked her. I drove to Ruth's, and I sat at her kitchen table, and I asked if she would be willing, if the worst ever happened to Evan and me, to raise Oliver and Nora. I told her she could say no, that it was an enormous thing to ask. Ruth put down her tea, and she didn't hesitate for even a second. Yes, she said, of course I would. Those are wonderful children. She answered before I'd even finished the question, like she'd already thought about my kids as people who mattered. So I signed it, knowing she'd already said yes. I had it witnessed, and I put my copy in a folder at home, a different folder, my folder. I told Evan a few days later, because you don't keep a thing like that from the person you'd be dying alongside. I told him at the kitchen table, after the kids were down, and I braced for him to argue, to say it was too harsh, to defend my parents the way people outside a family sometimes do. He didn't. He listened to the whole thing, and he was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "You know what? Good. I never understood why they were the default anyway. We picked them when Oliver was a baby because we didn't know better." And then he said the thing that told me I'd married the right man. "Who'd you name instead?" Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Isn't that extreme?" Just, "Okay, so who catches our kids if we fall?" A man who thinks about the catch, not the optics. I told him. He nodded slowly and said, Yeah, that's right." And that was the whole conversation. That's what it looks like when someone's actually on your side. It's quick because there's nothing to argue about. Because some quiet, clear-eyed part of me, 3 weeks before my mother ever left my kids on a porch, already knew. I just hadn't let the rest of me hear it yet. I'll tell you who I named. But first, you need to know what my parents did next, because it's the reason the name mattered. Here's what happened after my father collected them from Ruth's. Ron drove Oliver and Nora back to my parents' empty house and sat them in front of the TV and called Evan to say flatly that the kids were fine, they're here, come get them whenever. That's the call Evan was on when I was waking up. He'd told me the kids were safe with my dad, true, technically, and then the moment I was stable, he drove to my parents and brought our children home himself. My mother was still at the party. My father handed Evan the kids and their bags like luggage someone had grown tired of holding. I got home from the hospital the next day. Evan had brought the kids home the night before, and when I walked in, moving slow, drain still in, unable to lift Nora the way I wanted to, my daughter ran at my legs and my son stood back and studied my face to make sure I was really okay. And I got down on the floor carefully and held them both and did not cry until they'd gone to bed. Oliver told me about it that night in his flat, careful voice, in pieces, the way he tells hard things. He told me he watched Nora. He told me he didn't answer the door. He told me he did a good job watching Nora. And then he asked me, in the dark, in the smallest version of his voice, "Did I do it right, Mom? Grandma said I was in charge. Did I do it right?" And I told my 7-year-old son that he did everything right, that he was so brave, that he did a better job than any grown-up could have, and I meant it. And I lay in the dark after he fell asleep, and I made a promise to that boy that he would never again, not once, be put in a position where a 7-year-old had to be the responsible adult because the actual adults chose a party. Never again. I would burn the whole family down first. And it turned out I wouldn't even have to. I just had to stop holding it up. But here's the part I didn't see coming. The part that turned my quiet anger into something with no bottom to it. Oliver didn't bounce back, not right away. My rule-following boy, who'd held it together so perfectly for 2 hours, started coming apart in small ways over the next week. The way a dam doesn't break all at once, it just starts weeping through the cracks. He wouldn't let me leave a room without asking where I was going and when I'd be back. He started sleeping on the floor of Nora's room, in case she needs something, a 7-year-old appointing himself night watchman. And one evening, when I said I had to run to the pharmacy, a 10-minute errand, he grabbed my hand at the door, and his face did a thing I'd never seen it do. And he asked, in that small voice, "Who's in charge while you're gone?" Who's in charge? That's the sentence that broke me. Because I understood, finally, the full size of what my parents had done. They hadn't just left my kids alone for 2 hours. They'd taught my son, in the most concrete way a child can learn anything, that the adults might not come back. That being safe was his job now. That at 7 years old, he was one bad afternoon away from being in charge again, and he had better stay ready. That is not a thing you undo with a hug and a promise. It took months. Oliver saw a play therapist all that summer, a woman who let him build the same Lego house over and over, and taught him that some houses have grown-ups in them who stay. He's okay now, but he wasn't for a while. And nobody who left him at that window has ever once asked whether he was. So when I tell you what I did next, the locks, the forms, the will, understand I wasn't doing it over one afternoon. I was doing it over a boy who now had to be taught, by a professional, that adults can be trusted to come home. You do not get to do that to my child and stay on the emergency contact list. That night, the night I got home, after the kids were asleep, after Oliver asked me in the dark if he'd done it right, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my phone, and I did the whole thing in about 3 hours. Calm, methodical, the way I write a care plan. I called a locksmith, the 24-hour kind, and paid the emergency rate, and had every lock on the house changed by midnight, because my mother had a key, and my mother had proven exactly what she'd do with access to my home and my children. I logged into the school's parent portal and removed my parents from the emergency contact list, and from the authorized pickup list, the list of people allowed to take my children out of a building. I called our insurance and changed the secondary contacts. I emailed the pediatrician's office. One by one, every place my parents' names sat on a form as people trusted with my children, I took them off, and I typed different names in. Evan, Priya, and, on the forms that had room, Ruth Doyle, 2 doors down. And then the will, which was already done, already signed, already true for 3 weeks. I just took my copy out of its folder and set it on the table and looked at it. And I understood that the paper I'd signed on a hunch had become, on Tuesday, simply accurate. That's the thing nobody in my family understood about what came next. They thought I was doing something to them. My mother called it cutting them out of our lives over one afternoon. Brooke posted something online, without names, about family who abandon you the second you set a boundary. which the sheer nerve of that from her at her party. My father left a voicemail, stiff and formal, about how your mother is very upset and how I was punishing two people who love those kids. But I wasn't doing anything to them. I was just finally stopping. For 36 years, I had been the one holding up a version of this family that only worked if I absorbed every failure, made every excuse, packed every folder, and never, ever presented the bill. I was the load-bearing wall of a house full of people who thought the house just stood up on its own. And all I did that day was stop being the wall. The locks weren't revenge. My mother had a key and had proven what she'd do with access. The emergency contacts weren't spite. Emergency contact means the person you trust in an emergency, and I just watched, in the most literal possible way, what my parents do in one. I wasn't punishing them. I was, at long last, believing them. They'd shown me who they were for 36 years, and on that Tuesday, they showed my children too. And I finally believed them. The Sunday after the surgery, they showed up at my door. All three of them, my mother, my father, and Brooke, who I hadn't even spoken to, who inserted herself because Brooke cannot bear to not be the center of a drama, even when the drama is about how she pulled our parents away from my children. I saw them through the window. My mother had her church face on, wounded and dignified. My father stood behind her with his arms crossed. Brooke was already talking before I opened the door. I opened it, but I didn't unlock the screen. That detail mattered, and they clocked it. A locked screen door between us, and me on the inside. "Dana," my mother said in her reasonable voice, "this has gone far enough. We're your parents. Those are our grandchildren. You cannot keep them from us over a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I said. "You left them alone. Oliver ate a peanut butter sandwich at Mrs. Doyle's house because you weren't there to feed him. He's 7. He thought he was in charge of keeping his sister alive." "You are ruining this family," Brooke cut in, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Over one afternoon." One afternoon. I looked at my sister when she said it. Brooke, whose party it was. Brooke, who called our mother at 10:40 that morning and asked her to leave 2 small children to come admire a table of jewelry. Brooke, who has never once been the reliable one, who has floated through 33 years on the certainty that someone else would handle the boring parts of being alive. Standing on my porch, telling me I was ruining the family. "It wasn't one afternoon, Brooke," I said. "You called Mom to come to your party. Maybe you didn't know they'd leave the kids to do it, I'll give you that. But when Mom and Dad chose your launch over 2 children they'd promised to watch, you're the reason they had to choose it all. And not one of you has asked in a week whether Oliver is okay. So don't stand on my porch and tell me about family." And here's the thing I noticed as I said it. I wasn't shaking. My voice wasn't doing the thing it does when I'm upset, the tightening. I was calm. Total, quiet calm, the kind I did not know I was capable of. Because somewhere in the last week, I had stopped needing them to understand. 36 years I'd spent needing my mother to see it, to get it, to finally understand what she'd done and be sorry. And standing on that porch, I realized the need was just gone, lifted clean out of me. I didn't need her to understand anymore. I only needed her to leave. "I want to tell you all something," I said through the screen. "And then I want you to go home." And I told them, not angrily, just plainly, the way you read a diagnosis. I told them that 3 weeks before the surgery, I'd updated my will. That in the old one, if anything happened to Evan and me, the kids went to them. And that I'd changed it, before the surgery, before the porch, before any of it. My mother's face changed then, the church face cracking, something real underneath it. "You did that before," she said slowly, "before Tuesday. So you'd already decided I'd already known," I said. "I just hadn't admitted it yet. Tuesday didn't change my mind, Mom. Tuesday just proved I was right to have already changed it." "Who?" my father said. First word he'd spoken the whole time. He'd been standing behind my mother with his arms crossed, and now he uncrossed them. "Who did you name?" And there it was, the question I'd been walking toward for 3 weeks, since a Thursday afternoon in Sandra Klein's office, when I'd sat in a chair and finally let myself finish the thought. The name I'd been carrying quietly the whole time. The name that had been true before Tuesday and was only proven by it. "Ruth Doyle," I said. My father's face didn't understand it yet. "Who?" "Mrs. Doyle, the neighbor, 2 doors down." I watched it land. "The woman who fed your grandchildren while you were at a party." The silence on my porch was a physical thing. I could hear a lawnmower a few houses over. I could hear my mother breathing. "The neighbor," she said finally. "You named the neighbor to raise our grandchildren, over us. Their family." "I named the woman who has made my children soup when they were sick," I said. "Who read them bedtime stories on our date nights. Who, when they showed up alone and frightened on her porch, brought them inside and fed them and called everyone she could think of. I named her 3 weeks ago, and I asked her first, and she said yes before she ever had to prove it. She's not a stranger, Mom. She's the person who's been showing up for my kids for years while you forgot their birthdays. I didn't choose her over family. I chose the person who acts like family over the people who only share the blood." "She's not even family," my mother whispered. "You want to know what family is?" I said, and I felt my voice go steady in the way it does right before it doesn't. "Family is a 7-year-old who now asks who's in charge before I walk to the pharmacy. That's what you left me with. Not a scare, not a story we'll laugh about someday. A little boy who has to be taught by a therapist that grown-ups come back. That's what you did with 2 hours." My mother had no church face left. She'd gone pale and small. My father was looking at the ground. And Brooke, for once in her life, said nothing at all. "Ruth Doyle is going to raise my children if I die," I said, quieter now. "The woman you're calling a stranger, the one who opened her door while you were at a party. And every single day between now and then, she's going to be the person my kids know they can count on. Because you had that job, both of you, for 36 years. And on the one Tuesday it mattered, you gave it to a 7-year-old and drove to a launch." And I closed the door. Not hard. I just closed it, and I turned the lock, the new lock, the one my mother didn't have a key to, and I listened to the 3 of them stand on my porch for a while, and then leave. The aftermath. 3 things: the practical, the painful, and the one that healed. The practical. There was no legal battle because there was nothing to battle. A will is a will. A mother gets to name her own children's guardians. Grandparents have no automatic right I was obligated to honor. My parents talked, for a while, about getting a lawyer, the way people do when they want you to be afraid. But any lawyer would have told them what mine told me. A fit parent decides who raises her children. Full stop. There was nothing to contest. I hadn't taken anything from them. I'd simply declined to keep giving them a thing they'd shown me, over and over, they would not carry carefully. The painful. It's my father. My mother, I understand. My mother is a woman who has never once in her life believed the rules of consequence applied to her convenience. And you cannot be wounded, not really, by a person behaving exactly as they always have. But my father is not a foolish man. My father knew better, and did it anyway. And that's a different thing. A week after the porch, he called me. First time he'd called me in maybe a year. And in his stiff, careful way, he said, "Your mother didn't think it through, Dana. You know how she is." And I waited, because some 9-year-old part of me is always still waiting for my father to finally say the right thing. And he said, "But changing the will, naming a stranger, that's a lot. That's going to hurt your mother for a very long time." And there it was. I counted later the things my father said in that phone call. He said my mother didn't think it through. He said I'd hurt her. He said the will was too much. And I waited the whole call for the one sentence that never came, the sentence any grandfather should lead with, the only sentence that mattered. "Is Oliver okay? Is Nora okay? Are the kids all right?" He never asked. Not in that call, not in any call, not once. Neither of them ever asked whether my children were okay. They asked whether I was overreacting. They asked whether I'd hurt their feelings. They asked whether I was ruining the family. Nobody in the entire aftermath asked about the 7-year-old who stood at a window for 2 hours, waiting. That's the wound I'll carry. Not that they left my kids. People make mistakes, even terrible ones. It's that afterward, given every chance, they never once thought to ask about the children they left behind. And the thing that healed, it's Ruth. The week after the porch, I walked 2 doors down and sat at Ruth's kitchen table, the one with the plastic tablecloth where my kids had eaten their sandwiches, and I thanked her. Not for saying yes. She'd said yes 3 weeks earlier, before any of it. I thanked her for being, on an ordinary Tuesday, exactly the person I'd already known she was. She waved me off. "You don't thank someone for feeding hungry children, Dana," she said. "You just feed them." Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like being handed 2 children is a gift and not a burden. Which is the whole difference, isn't it? My mother heard, "Watch the kids," and felt inconvenienced. Ruth heard the same words and felt trusted. She comes to Sunday dinner now, every week. Oliver reads to her because her eyes aren't what they were, and he takes it very seriously, sounding out the hard words. She tells Nora stories about being a girl during a war, in a country Nora can't find on a map, and my fearless daughter, who sits still for no one, sits still for Ruth. Last week, Nora fell asleep on Ruth's shoulder during one of the stories, and Ruth just sat there, not moving, letting her arm go numb rather than wake her. I watched from the kitchen, and I had to turn around for a minute. Ruth Doyle did not become our family because a piece of paper says she can raise my children if I'm gone. She became our family the way all real family is made. She opened a door on an ordinary Tuesday when 2 small people needed her to. And my parents, 3 miles away, holding glasses of Prosecco, did not. A few weeks after all of it, I did one more quiet thing. I took the manila folder, the one my mother set on her hall table and never opened, the one with every number, every allergy, the words that calm Nora's nightmares. And I walked it 2 doors down and I gave it to Ruth. "In case you ever need it," I said. She read every page. She asked me what the green room meant, the thing I'd written for Nora's bad dreams, and I told her it was from a game, and now Ruth knows it too. The folder I made out of love finally got opened. It just got opened by the right person. And a month after all of it, I made pancakes on a Sunday morning, the ones I'd promised Oliver in the recovery room. Ruth came over. Nora demanded chocolate chips in the shape of a face. Oliver set the table without being asked, and then he stopped, counted, and quietly got a 5th plate down for Ruth and set her place next to his. A few weeks earlier, this was a boy who asked me who was in charge before I walked to the pharmacy. And here he was, unprompted, setting a place for the person he'd decided belonged at our table. Not because anyone told him to, but because he was 7 and he was finally, again, just a kid at a breakfast. A kid who no longer had to be in charge of anything but the syrup. That's the entire story, right there. Not the will, not the locks, not the porch. One boy, one extra plate, and the fact that he wasn't watching the door anymore. So that's the story. A folder full of a mother's careful love, unopened on a hall table. A 7-year-old at a window, waiting. And a neighbor who opened her door. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one who packs the folder, who shows up, and watched the people who were supposed to catch you choose a party instead, hear this from someone who lived it. Loyalty isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who open the door. Some of the people you're waiting on will never become who you need them to be, and that is not yours to fix. Look at who actually shows up. Sometimes it's the neighbor, and sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is stop holding up a house that was never yours to carry, and go set your table for the people who came when it counted. My kids are okay. Oliver laughs more than he used to, a boy learning that being in charge isn't his job anymore, that the adults will actually be there. Nora remembers none of it, which is the mercy of being 5. Change the locks if you have to. Feed the people who feed your children. And when someone shows you on an ordinary Tuesday exactly who they are, believe them the first time. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one.